Okay, and we are live. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you Shree and Stephen for being with us on this important topic. Before we get started, I'd like to do a territory acknowledgement. The work of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning a gathering place, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. And again, in addition to this territory acknowledgement, I also wanted to extend solidarity to with the Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing struggle of Black and Indigenous communities to fight for justice. Today's session I'm really excited about this session and the ongoing couple of sessions we're going to be doing with the Anti-Hate Conversation series. Today's session will focus on racism within racialized communities. And we have Stephen Zhou and Shree Paradkar as our guests for today's session. And just a quick bio on the two speakers before we start our discussion. Shree Paradkar is a Toronto Star race and gender columnist and is the 2018 and 2019 recipient of the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy. She is the author of Betrayed, My Cousin's Wrongful Conviction for the Murder of Her Daughter, Arushi. She has been the journalist in Bangalore, Mumbai, Singapore, and Toronto. Thank you, Shree, for being with us today. I know it's a crazy time for you right now, and we're really grateful for you to take your time out to be with us. Stephen Zhou is a freelance journalist based in Toronto who focuses on national security, Islamophobia, and the far right. He has worked for CBC, Vice, and the Ottawa Citizen. You can read his work in foreign policy in the Globe and Mail, the LA Review of Books, and the Nation magazine. Thank you, Stephen, for being with us today. So for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, just a bit of a background about this series. It's part of CASA's ongoing work with our anti-hate community leaders group. And these sessions take place every Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And we usually broadcast them on our Facebook Live, and we also upload them on our YouTube channel after the session. So with today's session and the next couple of sessions, as we all know that we are seeing anti-Black racism protests and anti-Indigenous racism protests throughout the world in various different municipalities, and particularly here in North America. And there's been some valid concerns from people about the sustainability of the momentum that we have right now and making sure that this leads to some deep and systemic change. So it doesn't just result in protests and then that's the end of it. We want to make sure that there's some changes that result from it. So one of the things that we wanted to do is to take a look at issues that surround anti-racism and solidarity, and what the role of South Asians and other racialized communities is in this. And we also want to know what our role is in dismantling the systemic racism, what our role is in dismantling anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and as an organization that focuses on empowerment of South Asian Canadians, it's the only way to move forward for us is to be against all forms of racism. So it's not an area where we can pick and choose and say we're against, Islamophobia, but, we practice anti-Black racism. So we need to stand together and we need to together push the barriers, and we need to do this in solidarity. So this is kind of the reasoning behind why we're going to focus a little bit on solidarity for the next couple of weeks. So, and because you only have half an hour, we're going to get right into it. So this is a question for both of you. So any of you can take it on or take turns answering it. So we know as activists in the area of anti-racism that Canada has a problem with systemic and institutional racism. But we also know that there is a problem of racism and classism within racialized communities in Canada. So this is not just a problem for countries that are outside of our sphere or people or countries that are considered our home countries. So this is a problem here in Canada too. Where do you think this stems from, and what are the factors leading to the rise of it? So we don't see it diminishing anytime soon. So what contributes to it continuing to rise?
I can go first, Steve, unless you want
First,
to.
please. No, please.
So just want to clarify that for the purposes of today's discussion, when I'm talking about racialized communities, I'm talking about people who are neither white but nor black as well. I'm talking about South Asians, East Asians, West Asians, maybe Latin Americans to a certain extent. To a certain extent, only because I'm not as familiar with the cultures. But I think it's really important to classify the discriminations that we face, that the discriminations that we inflict, which is that anti-blackness is common to all of us. All of us who are not white, not black, do this to others. And then among South Asians and among non-Muslims, I would say Islamophobia is one that's common as well. And one that's not acknowledged, which is definitely a South Asian thing, is casteism, which also happens in Canada. I say this, unfortunately, Equality Labs in the US had a study that showed that casteism is alive and thriving in the US. There has been no such study in Canada, but the very fact that somebody like me, who's of a so-called upper caste, knows nobody who is either Dalit or the officially called other backward class, while they exist in Canada, shows what kind of barriers there are even among us. So I think, to me, it's very important to name all those discriminations that exist within racialized communities. And we're also placed in this very interesting place where, as people who are neither white nor black, we suffer on the one hand from being not white, but we also benefit on the other hand from being not black. And we are quite well aware of which side our bread is buttered. We don't necessarily critique capitalism. We don't necessarily critique our own values or the fact that we have so many times abandoned our own supposedly traditional values when we go and try to please power. And so we forget whom we are trampling, or we don't care whom we are trampling on the way to getting that power. So I want to be really, really clear that, we are both. We are beneficiaries of the system as well. I do want to talk a little bit about whiteness, but maybe Stephen, if you go first, and then I can just talk a bit about whiteness to understand the roots of why we have this. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I think we are part of communities, all part of ethno-nationalist groups that have to deal with the other. And we can choose to apply compassion, or we can take the other route, the alternative route of, I think, the racist otherization, which I think particularly for the Chinese Canadian community, which I've been part of for most of my life, and for other communities, non-Black, people of color, we've internalized the kind of racist taxonomy that's been with us for several hundred years, that emanated from different parts of Europe as a part of imperial and colonialist legacies. And I think that migrates with us, obviously. And once we're here, we live within a society that's guided and structured with white dominant norms, and we measure ourselves up against that hierarchy, which places or has placed for a long, long time Black people at the bottom, different kinds of Asians in the middle, white people at the top. And certainly people won't express it in such explicit ways, but I think beneath the surface of the superficialities of who we are, I think those aspects are internalized in different parts of ourselves. I just wanted to follow up and say that this is now something that's being politicized more than ever because of the right-wing racist revanchism throughout different parts of the world, and certainly in Canada, certainly in the United States, most obviously. And parts of the Chinese community, the mainland Chinese community, which is a very new community that has migrated en masse or in large numbers, relatively large numbers within the past 20, 25 years, and they're just coming into their own politically as an organized sub-electorate. And they're engaged by different entities within Canada, some of which are, are right-wing politicians or conservative politicians who believe that, are doing their homework, are engaging multicultural Canada as best they can. And their version of doing it with the Chinese Canadian community, for example, is to say that Chinese values are right-wing values and conservative values, which carry with it different kinds of assumptions, prejudices, around refugees, around public safety, around post 9/11 politics, etc., that have been appropriated by the far right and also the conventional political right in Canada. And I think that's something very important that we have to look towards, because it's about time that the more progressive and other parts of the political spectrum in Canada engages these communities as well.
Thank you. Shree, I know you wanted to add a few more points to that question.
I think Stephen already alluded to it, the hierarchy, which is whiteness, and I would say that more than a ladder or a pyramid, I see it as a lattice, where you put cisgender, able-bodied white men, wealthy white men in the center, and then white women are the closest beneficiaries. And then the closer you are to whiteness, whether it's by skin color, whether it's by class, whether it's by sexuality, whether it's by being able-bodied, the more you benefit. And always, always, the farthest end of white is black. And so the closer you go to black, the more you are discriminated against. I see it more as a lattice only because then we can visualize the intersectionalities of black as an identity, but then trans black as an identity. How is a white gay person treated versus a black gay person treated? And there is that compounding effect of discriminations that happen. So I wanted to put that out there to say that, as Stephen pointed out, that whiteness is something that we have internalized. I don't want to blame all of the discriminations among South Asians only on colonialism, on European colonialism necessarily, although that played a big role. And current day globalization foments it further, or cements it further. But I do want to say that, for instance, before it became Islamophobia because of the change in power imbalance, there would have been Hindu-Muslim animosity since the 8th century, or maybe more like since the 12th century. But when Muslims first came to the land as traders in about 8 AD, we would have had casteism well before we were colonized by Europe. And so these are deeply entrenched biases, which whiteness just further exacerbated. And so you would have a lighter skinned Muslim is treated better than a darker skinned Muslim, even within brown people. Mm-hmm. And definitely the so-called lowest caste has a whole implication of shade and color. Mm-hmm. Where, again, if you're lighter, you're automatically seen as wealthier. And perhaps it's because it meant you're not out in the sun and you're not a peasant, that you could afford to be indoors, right? And so there is that whole association of wealth. And then when European colonizers came in, it cemented the idea that lighter was better. And we carry that prejudice so deeply within.
Mm-hmm. So with such deep prejudice that are so ingrained into our history, how do we then convince racialized communities, so again, non-Black racialized communities, who display practice of racism, to stand firmly against oppression of Black and Indigenous communities? How do we do that? Like, it has such a long history. It's so entrenched into our cultures, even into our media. Like, if you're looking at media, South Asian media, like, you can see the shadeism is so prevalent. It's, how do we dismantle that?
I guess I'll take a stab at it. I think it comes down, particularly when it comes to individual actions and individual agency, it comes down to spheres of influence. And I myself, I start with myself, and I branch out to parts of my family. And sometimes it seems like, when it's a family gathering, we spend half the time together kind of debunking each other's assumptions and myths. And um, I feel like there's a bit of a generational gap here, although I don't want to exaggerate that. And what can I say? I believe, we all, whether or not we like to acknowledge it, we come from different ethnocultural, perhaps religious traditions, and we have and there's a whole spectrum of things there that we're attached to, some of which, the best of which, we can choose to emphasize among people who resonate with it, that is, people within our own ethnic communities and so forth, and to combine that with education, anti-racist education, education of other peoples, solidarities between peoples, solidarity with indigenous realities, with familiarization with um, Black community and their struggle against not just police brutality, but different kinds of oppression that have characterized the United States, for example, and also Canada for several hundred years. And so I think there's a lot of moving parts. I don't think that it's something that we can address. I think it's a permanent, ongoing process. There's nothing that we can do, just magically in 3 months or 4 months of lockdown that'll solve everything. But right now, the protests in the United States are unprecedented. They're actually global protests now in Europe, etc. And it's punched open a hole. It's opened a door, but it's up to everybody to walk through it.
Mm-hmm. Just to add to that a little bit, partly I don't believe anybody can be trained or educated out of biases, prejudices, and racism. And yet I feel it's important, because we are so racially illiterate as a society and as the world, we don't have any real understanding of oppression, uh, to have that conversation, just so that nobody can say, I didn't know. Oh, I didn't know. If I had known this, I would have been different. And I think it's really important for all non-Black racialized people on this continent to understand that if we've come here in this modern era, we came because of the civil rights movement and protests like these in the past that opened the door to non-white immigrants, and to non-white immigrants of a high educational background. So we were always, it's not that we came here at the same level as, we didn't come here as slaves and then suddenly just worked our way up out of it. No, we came here as people who are, chances are, of an oppressor background somewhere else, because we were already privileged there, which allowed us to make it in Canada, or to make it to the door in Canada or in the US. And so we were set up to succeed. Now we are used as a cudgel to be able to tell Black people, look, these guys did it, why can't you guys? And we internalize that praise too. We are so hungry for white praise that rather than critically think about, is that really true? We internalize that and we are happy for that. We are happy to be patted on the back, because it just, we hunger for it. And so I think partly it's important that we understand whom we owe our presence here to. Partly, I don't have necessarily a lot of patience for educating people, but what Stephen said is we have to do a lot of self work, which means we show up either at protests or we in whatever sphere of influence we can in our lives, but call out. It means we're going to lose people. And so, yeah, we make that sacrifice, but call out. And I found, because I've been calling out South Asians for years, even before I came to Canada. So before I knew there was an identity called South Asian. And I find at the very least, what happens is people around me keep quiet when it comes to certain issues. It doesn't mean they've changed. Maybe they've changed from point A to point A, point one. But at the same time, then at least around me, they're wary, and it makes them think twice. And that awareness, I think, is, I'll take that. Meanwhile, I have to move on. I can't wait for them to change.
Mhm. So what does that look like, Shree? Like in terms of, so I'm not talking about people generally in the community. What does that look like from our own social circles? What kind of conversations should we start with within our friends, our immediate friends, our immediate family? We're going to have a session next week on parents and elders, which is something, in our communities is a little bit tricky. So I wanted to do a separate session on that. But the rest of the social circle, um, how do we begin that conversation?
How do we begin it? I'll only go by my experience, which maybe is not advisable for people who want to keep their relationships going. But it is just to literally to say, hey, what does that mean? Does that make you an Islamophobe? Does that make you anti-black? Are you being a racist? And what I find astounding is, with white people, being called a racist has a particular sting, which I don't find racialized people have. And so, worst case, if you're called racist, like, yeah, okay, so what? So there is, so it's not about shaming anybody either. It's just saying, like, look at what you're saying. How would you like it if somebody did that to you? How would you like it? Oh, they'll say, I'm not racist, I'm so successful. It's like, okay, then where are all the multicultural people around you? Why do all your social circles look like you? If it is, if there is no racism here, then where are all the white people in your social circles? They don't exist. Why do they not exist? Do you really think that they look at you as an equal? And how does that make you feel? Now, turn that around. How would it make a black person feel if they knew how we talk about them? And this is just at an individual level, but what does it mean at a hiring level? If you're doing this here, dude, when you're working at BMO, what are you actually saying? I knew a man from Citibank at a senior position who said he wouldn't work with some client because he was Pakistani, right? And the senior man at Citibank was a Sikh man, right? So it's like, what are you actually saying? So you're going to carry these biases, and you're making it okay to be discriminated against, because you can't say I will be a discriminator but not be discriminated. We don't have that luxury as non-white people. So I do think it's really important to point to the hypocrisy of discriminating against other people. And we are in a position here in Canada where we can have that conversation.
Stephen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, Shree was talking about calling out, and I think that's generally the easiest and most effective way to go about it, because these things do pop up out of the behaviors and mouths of our loved ones often. And I find conversations within my own family to be more difficult than calling out my coworkers or some of my friends and some of my white friends. And I think the one thing I've noticed is the longer some of these immigrant communities have been here, the more learned they become with um, stereotypes and rationalizations and the kind of rhetoric that's used and clothed in working hard, pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps, not blaming other people, not being a whiner, that kind of neoliberal mantra. And that, I think, is becoming more and more common among middle class, upper middle class immigrants who I understand they want security for themselves, security for their children, and somehow that means kicking the person below them, worshiping the person above them, and being fearful of the person beside them for fear of them getting up more than me or something like that. And this idea, traces itself back, I think, to the idea that as long as human beings pursue their quote unquote rational self-interest above all else, then that's the best thing for everybody. You know, as long as all institutions are run on the idea of, you know, to make as much money as possible and to increase efficiency and all that stuff. I mean, that is the vehicle for fusing together socioeconomic inequality and the racist hierarchy that we live in, and they're really the same thing. And you know, I think that that kind of really exposes the performative activism that we see from, say, you know, the Liberal Party, you know, in our country, and the Democratic Party in the United States, when Nancy Pelosi or who are, you know, Justin Trudeau are taking a knee because it's convenient to do so, and they're not addressing any of the structural socioeconomic problems that have upheld the racist hierarchies for a long time. And it becomes just kind of unchangeable background over the years for a lot of immigrants who just want to do well for themselves, out of fear of, you know, their kids not doing as well, or that kind of thing. And I think it's we have to acquire the language to address that among our immediate spheres of influence. And for me, at least, that begins with myself, my family, my friends.
Great, thank you. So one last question before we have to close for today. So what about the people that do have a racial equity lens, people that do get it, and they do support other communities, they support the Black community, Indigenous communities, but are not necessarily part of it and are racialized? What is kind of the one most important step for them to take right now?
I'll go first. So, what would solidarity look like right now? Stephen referred to performative solidarity, and I think what we want is transformative. So, definitely, sure, taking part in protests would be great. But then, I think, you know, in that sphere of influence we just talked about, if you're at a school, for instance, and you find that your child is not learning about anti-Black racism at the moment, where really there should be no child not learning about it at this very moment, write to your principal. You know, I tell them, hey, why is my child not learning about this? It shouldn't have to fall upon a Black person to have to raise these issues. So we need to say, when will my, you know, what's happening for, well, before February, hey, what's happening for Black History Month? What Canadian content are we learning? What resources? Here are some resources, and send them back. You know, so this is just at school. Similarly at work, you know, ask, if you're not Black, ask your bosses. I mean, one thing that happens as a person of color in your workplace is that you want to try to fit in so badly that you don't digress from that narrow path that's been set to you. Well, then pick up the courage now and say, hey, where are the Black voices on this? Where are the Black people in our office? Where are the Indigenous people in our office? You know, they're not some backward tribals as we like to think they are, right? And so I think push for more Black visibility. And don't expect all, you know, don't expect gratitude. I think that's really important. Don't do this without expecting any gratitude. And don't expect Black people or First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people to all be thinking the same. You might promote something and you might think, oh, this is really, you know, we need more Black voices. But you might have a Black person who undercuts you because they have also brought into, you know, into this concept of whiteness. So that could happen. So it can be a very isolating experience, but your conscience, right, comes first.
That's really good advice. Thank you. Stephen, any last piece of advice?
Just very quickly, you know, it's not a time to get up, you know, on our own. You know, so many people have magically found their activist pulpit, and to get on it and then blast. Apparently, they've all figured out the solution to these structural problems. All of a sudden, it would be nice to hear these solutions before police killings and demonstrations and all that. But I feel like for us, for at this moment at least, and I think applicable to so many other moments, it's not the right time to feel like, oh, you know, my voice is the voice that needs to be heard. It needs to be heard, but in a peripheral kind of supportive way. And it doesn't have, you don't always have to be, you know, leading the charge of the vanguard of the activism wave that changes the world into a great utopia or anything like that. And if we haven't influenced people who are closer to us and who we have influence over, if we haven't tried at least, we've not leveraged those relationships, I'm not sure how much non-Black people of color can really say, you know, we can all of a sudden influence society. And also, I would suggest that that relationships need to be formed between activist circles and communities of color, non-Black communities of color, because the interaction right now is going the other direction. Conservative, more, you know, corporatist, for-profit groups and lobbying groups, chambers of commerce, so on and so forth, are engaging communities of color, I think, in a wider sense right now. And progressives have to kind of play catch up in a way. That's my experience anyway. And yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today, but we will be back next week. And like I said, the focus will be on, again, racism within racialized communities, but how to engage parents and elders in conversations of anti racism. Thank you, Shree. Thank you, Stephen, for being with us today. And please don't forget to tune in next week, Tuesday at 4 o'clock. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.